Imagine, if you will, a candlelit chamber tucked within ancient stone walls. Outside, Rome slumbers under a blanket of stars. Inside, a man in white silk robes leans back on a golden throne, not in prayer, but in deep political contemplation. Or perhaps he's just deciding which relative to appoint as cardinal next. Welcome to the medieval papacy. Not a tranquil sanctuary of solemn chants and holy meditation, but a turbulent court of intrigue, ambition, and the occasional scandal so bizarre it makes Renaissance tabloids look tame. Tonight, you won't find solemn sermons or haloed saints. No, tonight, we peel back the velvet curtain of history and tiptoe through the whispered corridors of power where popes didn't always act like saints, and sainthood wasn't exactly a requirement. You see, the papacy in the Middle Ages wasn't just a spiritual post. It was one of the most contested seats of power in all of Europe. To be pope meant more than blessing the faithful. It meant crowning emperors, excommunicating enemies, and in some cases, drinking deeply from the goblet of very unholy behavior. So tonight, as you settle beneath your blanket and let your breathing slow, allow yourself to drift gently into the past. The lights dim, the candles flicker, and you are transported to a world of crimson robes, whispered bribes, and papal courts that resembled royal soap operas. Close your eyes. The scandals are just beginning now. Picture this. You're in Rome. The year is 955. And the church has just appointed its new pope. He's not a revered elder, not a scholar steeped in theology, not even particularly interested in prayer. No, the freshly crowned head of Christendom is an 18-year-old noble named Octavian who promptly changes his name to John XII, presumably because Pope Octavian sounds more like a gladiator than a vicar of Christ. He wasn't chosen for holiness. He was chosen because his family had the money, the muscle, and the Roman street smarts to make it happen. And once he got the job, well, John treated the papacy like a personal amusement park. The Lateran Palace, Rome's sacred hub of church authority, became a den of indulgence. Dice games in the throne room, drunken feasts in the chapel, and, allegedly, mistresses wandering the halls like confused nuns who took a wrong turn. One chronicler claimed John turned the palace into a brothel. Another wrote that he blessed people with his left hand, the medieval equivalent of flipping the faithful, the spiritual bird. He ordained deacons in stables, toasted pagan gods at banquets, and reportedly offered church lands in exchange for favors. But power wasn't just a game to young John. It was personal. He had political enemies blinded, tongues cut out, and once raised an army just to immediately lose it and beg for help from the German emperor. Then, naturally, he betrayed the emperor the moment his back was turned on. And how did it end? Not with a solemn final blessing, but with a stroke in bed, with a married woman. Some say it was divine judgment, others say it was her husband. Either way, the boy pope left the church with a headache and the papacy with one of its earliest cautionary tales. Now let's stay with Pope John XII just a little longer, because like any character in a medieval soap opera, his story doesn't wrap up neatly after a few scandals and a drunken feast. Oh no, this is the Middle Ages, after all, where drama is rarely in short supply. After a series of spectacularly unholy acts, gambling in sacred halls, blessing sinners with his left hand, and toasting Satan, yes, Satan at banquets, John eventually found himself in deep trouble. His chaotic rule, unpredictable alliances, and wild lifestyle had earned him enemies in every corner of Rome and beyond. At one point, desperate and surrounded, John sent word to Otto I, the German emperor. "Come save me," he cried, like a petulant teenager who had crashed his chariot and wanted dad to fix it. Otto, perhaps too noble or too curious, obliged. He marched into Rome, deposed John, and installed a new pope, one with fewer mistresses and more sobriety. But John, he wasn't done. He came back. Of course he did. Through bribery, threats, and the sheer chaotic charm of someone who had absolutely nothing left to lose. John XII took back the throne. For a brief moment, it looked like the Vatican was trapped in a comedy of errors with no punchline in sight. And then just as suddenly as John was gone, dead, collapsed in bed, next to a married woman. Some claimed it was a stroke. Others whispered it was divine punishment, and the more skeptical believed it was something far simpler, a jealous husband with a firm hand and very bad timing. However it happened, the boy pope was no more. And the chair of St. Peter's sighed in relief. If you thought one scandalous pope was enough for the night, let me introduce you to Benedict IX, a man who decided that being pope once just wasn't fulfilling enough. He became pope the first time around the year 1032. He was about 20 years old. Some say younger, which of course is much too young to run a global religion, but apparently just the right age for throwing lavish parties and bringing wild animals into the papal palace. Yes, wild animals. Benedict IX wasn't what you'd call spiritually mature. His reign was marked by so many rumors of immorality that medieval chroniclers began running out of words for unholy. He was accused of simony, bribery, orgies, and using the church like a personal playground. Eventually, even his supporters had enough. He was forced out by a rebellion. But Nessery came back. Twice. You see, Benedict wasn't just controversial, he was persistent. After being ousted, he returned, reclaimed the throne. And then here's the twist: sold the papacy. Yes, he literally sold the title of pope to his godfather for gold and a villa. Apparently he wanted to get married. Romantic, perhaps theologically horrifying, absolutely. But after the woman in question declined, as any sensible person might, when your suitor is a disgraced pope with a history of lions in the palace, Benedict had second thoughts, so he came back. Again, and once more, chaos reigned. The church now had 2 popes, and then eventually 3, each excommunicating the others like children arguing over who gets to wear the crown. Finally, the emperor intervened, and Benedict, he was excommunicated, banished, and mostly forgotten. Except by us here, in the quiet of this night, we remember him, the pope who sold his job, lost his love, and couldn't quite let go of the hat. Now, let's rewind just a little and take a closer look at what may be the most bizarre motivation ever recorded for a pope stepping down. Love. Yes, to love. Benedict IX, wild, scandalous, repeatedly pope decided, at one point, to give it all up: the palace, the power, the papal vestments, all for a woman. According to some accounts, he sold the papacy to his godfather because he wanted to marry her. A bold gesture, grand, almost poetic. Unfortunately, she said no. Perhaps she wasn't thrilled at the idea of dinner parties where half the guests were excommunicated. Or maybe the thought of being married to a man who treated the Vatican like a wine-soaked brothel didn't quite align with her life goals. Whatever the reason, she declined. And Benedict, heartbroken, humiliated, and still very much, Benedict decided to take the papacy back. Not for love anymore, no, for something far pettier: spite. He stormed back into Rome, seized control, and recrowned himself as pope. Again, it was less a spiritual calling and more a case of ecclesiastical revenge. This wasn't a man called by God. This was a man ghosted by a girl storming back into his old job like, fine, I didn't want to be married anyway. Of course, it didn't last. The church grew weary, the people confused, the emperor exasperated. Eventually, Benedict was excommunicated and cast into history not as a saint or even a villain, but as something strange: a romantic fool in papal robes, a man who traded God's throne for a chance at love, and ended up with neither. Now, if you thought papal scandals couldn't get any weirder, if you thought drunken banquets, bought-and-sold papacies, and spurned lovers in the Vatican were the peak of absurdity, then allow me to gently guide you into what might be the strangest episode in church history. It's called the Cadaver Synod. Yes, that's not a metaphor, it's exactly what it sounds like. A trial for a corpse. The year is 897. The Pope at the time, Stephen VI, has a grudge, a serious one, against his predecessor, Pope Formosus. The only problem: Formosus has been dead for nearly a year. But details. Stephen orders Formosus' body to be dug up, dressed in full papal robes, and dragged into a courtroom out there in front of a horrified crowd and an undoubtedly confused clergy. Pope Stephen convenes a full ecclesiastical trial against the rotting corpse of a former pope. They even assign the corpse a lawyer, a deacon, who has to stand beside the skeleton and argue its innocence, while trying not to gag. The charges: usurping the papacy, breaking canon law. Basically, you shouldn't have been pope. The dead man, silent throughout, is found guilty. His fingers of blessing are sliced off, his body is stripped of its robes, and then, as if the whole event wasn't already a medieval fever dream, the corpse is tossed into the Tiber River. Rome, to its credit, gasps. Even by 9th century standards, this was a bit much. Riots break out. The people demand justice. Stephen, once the proud prosecutor of corpses, is thrown in prison and quietly strangled, and the church, ashamed, pretends none of it ever happened. But tonight, beneath the flicker of imaginary candlelight, we remember, because nothing says medieval Christianity quite like putting a skeleton on trial. Now let's drift forward to the 14th century, when the popes, perhaps a little overwhelmed by Rome's chaos, politics, and the occasional mob with pitchforks, decided they'd had enough, so they left, packed their robes, sealed their scrolls, and relocated the papal court to the peaceful, wind-drenched town of Avignon in southern France. Officially, the move was for safety. Rome, after all, was turbulent, filled with rival factions, assassinations, and more than a few angry bishops. But conveniently, Avignon was also very much under French influence, and every pope elected during this period, well, they just happened to be French too. Thus began what history calls the Avignon papacy, and what Rome probably called the time our pope ghosted us. For nearly 70 years, the Vatican operated not from the Eternal City, but from a riverside palace, filled with velvet curtains, elaborate banquets, and wine cellars that would make a monastery blush. It wasn't so much a retreat as a renaissance of luxury. The papal court in Avignon became known less for holiness and more for fine dining and questionable budgeting. One pope reportedly spent more money on spices than on feeding the poor. But Rome stood empty, its basilicas echoing, its pilgrims disappointed, and its saints, perhaps silently fuming in their shrines. Eventually, pressure built, whispers turned to protest. The church's absence had become an embarrassment, and in 1377, Pope Gregory XI returned to Rome, weary from decades of exile and French cheese. But just as the church exhaled a sigh of relief, it accidentally set the stage for even more chaos, because what's worse than no pope in Rome, 2 popes in 2 cities? And a Europe forced to choose. So the pope finally came home to Rome. The Avignon exile had ended. The wine-soaked French countryside faded in the rearview mirror of history, and for a brief moment it seemed like peace had returned, but only for about 5 minutes, because in 1378, not long after the return, Pope Gregory XI died. Suddenly the church had a vacancy, and the Roman people, never once for subtlety, wanted an Italian pope, very loudly. With torches, the cardinals, mostly French and extremely nervous, quickly elected Urban VI, an Italian. Problem solved. Not quite. Urban, it turned out, was intense. He scolded cardinals, refused to compromise, and suspected plots everywhere. The cardinals, now deeply regretting everything, declared his election invalid, blaming mob pressure and perhaps indigestion, and elected a second pope, Clement VII, who moved back to Avignon. And just like that, the church had 2 popes. Both claimed to be the real one. Both excommunicated each other with all the flair of dramatic school principals. Europe split like a theological divorce. France, Scotland, and Spain back to Avignon, England. The Holy Roman Empire and most of Italy sided with Rome. Confused priests didn't know which pope to obey. Faithful peasants just wanted to know who could forgive their sins. And church leaders, they prayed for clarity and got more popes instead. In 1409, a council tried to fix things by firing both popes and electing a third. Unfortunately, the first 2 didn't quit, so for a brief and bewildering time there were 3 popes, 3 hats. 3 thrones, 3 men claiming to speak for God. It was, as historians lovingly put it, a theological dumpster fire. Now step carefully, dear listener, into the grand and shadowed halls of the Borgia family. It's the late 15th century. The Renaissance is in full bloom: art, science, discovery. But inside the Vatican, the perfume of power still smells like poison. Enter Rodrigo Borgia, better known as Pope Alexander VI, elected in 1492, the very same year Columbus sailed west. Rodrigo didn't just become pope, he became patriarch of the most infamous family to ever hold a chalice. He didn't hide his children, no, he celebrated them. His son Cesare Borgia was made a cardinal at 18, though his true talents lay in warfare, not theology. His daughter, Lucretia, was married off like a royal chess piece, strategically, repeatedly, and often into very unfortunate households. The papal court under Alexander wasn't a holy sanctuary. It was a stage where masked balls, whispered deals, and yes, rumors of orgies and poison played out beneath the frescoed ceilings of the apostolic palace. Enemies of the Borgias had a strange tendency to die often after dinner, and yet wasn't stupid. He was brilliantly political, managing alliances like a conductor, turning Vatican gold into personal empire. He crowned kings, waged secret wars, and built a dynasty in red and gold. He was the CEO of the church, with a dagger in one hand and a family crest in the other. Some called him a monster, others a master. He died in 1503, perhaps of malaria, perhaps of poison, perhaps of karma, but his name lived on in shadows, in whispers, in every tale where ambition dines with sin. Because when the Pope throws a feast, it's best to check your cup. Now let's turn our eyes to the next generation, because when your father is the Pope, and not just any Pope, but Alexander VI, the most ambitious Borgia in history, your childhood is unlikely to involve lullabies and apple picking. Let's begin with Cesare, the golden boy, the cardinal in crimson robes, and then, suddenly, the general in gleaming armor. He was made a cardinal at 18 because what says spiritual leadership, like a teenager with a short temper and a long sword. But Cesare wasn't built for church work. He was drawn to the battlefield, and when his brother Giovanni mysteriously died, dumped in a river, rumors pointed at Cesare. Even his father didn't seem particularly upset. Shortly after, Cesare resigned his post in the church and, almost unheard of, acted transformed overnight into a ruthless military commander, funded by papal coffers and fueled by family ambition. He carved his way across Italy like a Renaissance warlord, charming, brilliant, and absolutely terrifying. And then there was Lucretia. History has not been kind to her, depending on the account. She was either an innocent pawn or a scheming poisoner with a soft voice and steady hand. She was married 3 times, not for love, but for politics. 1 marriage annulled, 1 husband murdered, the 3rd survived long enough for her to become Duchess of Ferrara. The rumors never stopped, whispers of incest, poison rings, and secret lovers hidden in Vatican corridors. But beneath the scandal, there was also something real. Lucretia, the patron of the arts, the strategist, the survivor. Together, Cesare and Lucretia blurred the line between royal family and organized crime, and through it all, Pope Alexander looked on proudly, like a father at a school play, where everyone gets stabbed by Act 2. Now the curtain rises on a new pope, not a poisoner, not a seducer, not a schemer in silk gloves. No, Julius II was something entirely different. He was a general. They called him the warrior pope, and it wasn't a metaphor. This was a man who didn't just talk about reclaiming lost papal lands. He strapped on full armor, mounted a warhorse and led actual troops into battle. Sword in one hand, cross in the other. He cursed like a soldier, shouted orders in Latin, and made it very clear God might forgive his enemies, but Julius wouldn't. He wasn't soft, he wasn't subtle, but he had vision. Julius wanted Rome to rise again, not just spiritually, but artistically. And so, when he wasn't laying siege to rebellious cities, he was commissioning Michelangelo to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Job Michelangelo hated so much he wrote angry poetry while painting upside down for months. Julius would check on progress by climbing the scaffolding and yelling, artistic encouragement, Roman style. He also hired Raphael to decorate his papal apartments. He began rebuilding St. Peter's Basilica because why not make God's house look like a palace fit for Caesar? His papacy was thunderous loud, expensive, full of triumph and temper. He wasn't interested in forgiveness, he was interested in glory. When he died in 1513, not in battle, but in bed, it felt oddly anticlimactic, because this was a pope who seemed destined to go out swinging, sword raised to the heavens, shouting orders one last time. Instead, he left behind something quieter, but far more enduring, a Vatican stronger than ever, and a ceiling that still leaves visitors speechless. And now the battlefields fade, the swords are hung. And the next pope doesn't gallop into Rome with an army. No, he glides in wrapped in velvet, humming madrigals and wearing silk slippers. Meet Pope Leo X, born Giovanni de' Medici of the powerful Florentine banking family. When he took the papal throne in 1513, he reportedly said, "Since God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it." And enjoy it he did. Under Leo, the Vatican was no longer a war room. It became a salon, a palace of poetry, performances, banquets, and pet elephants. Yes, an elephant named Hanno, so beloved that Leo had a marble house built for it in the papal gardens. Lavish, certainly ridiculous. A little, but Leo saw the papacy not as a burden, but as a stage where art, wealth, and celebration could be forms of devotion, or at least very impressive party tricks. But then, the money began to run low. Julius's wars had left holes in the treasury. So, Leo turned to an old solution with new flair. Indulgences, forgiveness, sold at market price. Pay now, sin freely. Skip purgatory later. The faithful lined up coins, clinked. And somewhere in Germany, a monk named Martin Luther clenched his teeth and sharpened his nails. When Luther finally posted his 95 Theses in 1517, it was aimed straight at Leo's indulgence machine. Leo's response? He called Luther a drunken German who would change his mind when sober. Spoiler, he didn't, and the Protestant Reformation had begun. Leo died in 1521, reportedly from pneumonia, or eel. Or excess. Fitting, really, for a pope whose reign was a feast, from the first toast to the final bite. And now we hear it. Not trumpets, not sermons, not scandalous whispers behind velvet curtains, just a hammer. Clang. Echoing across a quiet university town in Germany. It's 1517. And a monk named Martin Luther is walking toward the door of the castle church in Wittenberg, holding a piece of parchment and a firm conviction. The parchment lists 95 Theses, not poetic musings, but direct, biting complaints against the church's growing indulgence business, against the idea that salvation could be bought, against the notion that forgiveness came with a receipt. And with one swing of the hammer, Luther didn't just pin paper to a door, he cracked a centuries-old wall. He didn't hate the church, he wanted to fix it, but the church, especially Pope Leo X, didn't take it well. At first, Leo dismissed Luther as a drunken monk who would change his mind when he sobered up. But Luther didn't sober up. He wrote, preached, translated the Bible into German, denied the Pope's authority entirely. And as his words spread faster than ever, thanks to that pesky new invention, the printing press, followers gathered, whole kingdoms listened. Princes declared loyalty to Protestantism. Suddenly Europe wasn't just arguing, it was splitting. The church that had stood for 1,000 years as a single institution cracked into two. The Protestant Reformation wasn't born of a rebellion, that it was born of a question, one that had lingered beneath centuries of silk and scandal. What if the church isn't always right? And tonight, as you lie in stillness, you might imagine that quiet monk with his parchment and his hammer, and the single clang that changed the world. Now, after all the popes and poisonings, perhaps you're ready for something gentler. Take a small detour into the medical beliefs of the Middle Ages, or as we might lovingly call them, beautifully wrong ideas wrapped in Latin. Medicine back then wasn't science, it was philosophy wearing a doctor's robe. And the human body, it was governed, so they believed, by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health was balance, illness was imbalance, and the solution, often more bleeding. They had a fever, they bled you. A headache, they bled you. Feeling sad, definitely bleed. Barbers, yes, the ones who cut Harold so carried leeches and sharp knives. You'd sit in the chair, get a shave, and possibly lose a pint of blood with your split ends. But it wasn't just bloodletting. People swallowed powdered mummy, actual ground-up human remains, because they believed it contained life energy. It rubbed mercury into wounds, used burnt hedgehog fat for baldness. And if none of that worked, they'd sometimes drink urine, because, well, someone thought it might help. And still, people survived. Laughed, loved, lived, because even surrounded by leeches and superstition, the human spirit endured. It's humbling, isn't it, to think of how many people tried with the best intentions to heal, with knowledge so far from the truth, and yet tonight, we remember them kindly, not with mockery, but with warmth, because the history of medicine is not just a tale of failure, it's a story of hope, one bloodletting at a time. And now, dear listener, we come to the end, not with judgment, not with fire, but with a soft sigh, as the last candle burns low in the papal halls of history. For all the scandals, all the feasts, all the whispered secrets behind marble walls, there's something deeply human in it all. Popes were supposed to be holy, and some were, but many were not. They were men, ambitious, flawed, frightened, brilliant. Some ruled like emperors, others loved like kings, a few sinned like devils and repented like saints. Their stories are not just history, they are reminders that power bends even the most sacred crowns, that religion can be both refuge and weapon, that institutions built to guide souls can at times lose their own, but also that through chaos something still endured. The church reformed, split, bled, rebuilt, and through every age, dark or golden, people still lit candles, still sang hymns, still believed in something greater. Perhaps that's the true miracle, that even when men in robes failed, the faith of those in rags persisted. And so tonight, as you lie beneath your own roof, in your own century, far from poisoned goblets and papal swords, take comfort in this. History is messy. People are messier. The telling of it, that, at least, can be peaceful. So close your eyes now, let the saints rest, let the sinners sleep, and let the stories carry you softly into dreams. The scandals are over. The night is yours. Good night is yours. Good night.